Good morning, everyone. Paddington 2, Chapter 11. Mrs. Brown told the family about her conversation with Mr. Gruber. If there's one person who can tell us more about the pop-up book, it's Madame Kozlova herself, she said. I'm going to see her and ask her what she knows. Mr. Brown wasn't sure it was such a good idea, but even he had to admit that they couldn't sit around doing nothing while poor Paddington was in prison. All right, he said, but I'm coming with you. He grabbed his coat. And me, said Judy. Me too, said Jonathan. The glamorous fortune-teller was not exactly pleased to see them. She observed them with a tight-lipped expression. Ah, so you're the family whose bear stole my pop-up book, she said. No, no, cried Judy. That's why we're here. We think the real thief broke into Mr. Gruber's shop to steal the book, and Paddington disturbed him. Paddington wouldn't do such a thing, Mrs. Brown assured Madame Kozlova. That's why we wanted to talk to you. Is there anything you could tell us about the pop-up book? Anything that could be useful to help us track down the thief? Madame Kozlova could see that the family really believed that Paddington was innocent. She was not an unkind woman, so she relented. All right, she said with a smile. Let's see now. My great-grandmother who started this fair made the pop-up book, she said in her Russian accent. She made lots of them to remember every single city she visited. But you may be right, there is something that could be an interest to the thief about this one. There's quite a peculiar story behind it, she said. Go on, said Mr. Brown, leaning forward. My great-grandmother was quite a showwoman, she said with a smile. She could tame lions, you know, and breathe fire and swallow swords. However, she was not the most famous for trapeze. They called her the Flying Swan. Imagine, she said, waving her arm with a dramatic gesture. In the 1930s, wherever my great-grandmother went, she was showered with gifts. The Browns sat back, picturing the glamorous fortune-teller and what she was describing. She was every man's favourite. Over the years, she made a fortune from all the presents she was given. One man even gave her a necklace of real diamonds, she said, with her eyes shining. How romantic, breathed Mrs. Brown. Ah, but where there's a fortune, there's always jealousy, she said. There was a magician who worked for the fair, who was a brilliant but envious man. He wanted my great-grandmother's fortune for himself. Oh, no, whispered Mrs. Brown. She was completely caught up in the story. What did he do? Something terrible, said Madame Kozlova. One day he cut through the trapeze rope. She made a scissor motion with her fingers. The Flying Swan became the Dying Swan. Oh, no, gasped Mrs. Brown. Yes, said the fortune-teller. My great-grandmother plummeted to the floor. The magician was the first on the scene. He rushed over, pretending to be concerned, but while he was checking my great-grandmother for signs of life, he took a key chain from round her neck and slipped away into the crowd before anyone could stop him. Mr. and Mrs. Brown exchanged glances. He went straight to my great-grandmother's caravan, the fortune-teller continued, and he opened up her safe. But instead of her treasure, all he found inside was her pop-up book of London. Serves him right, said Mrs. Brown. Madame Kozlova nodded. Quite so, she said. The police came after him, but he disappeared in a puff of smoke, leaving only the book behind. To this day, no one knows where my great-grandmother's fortune is hidden. That's a tragic story, said Mrs. Brown, dabbing her eyes. Yes, and it doesn't get us closer to understanding what on earth the thief wants with your book, said Mr. Brown. Thank you, Madame Kozlova. You have been the most generous with your time. The family headed back to number 32 Windsor Gardens, their hearts heavy as they wondered what they could do now to prove Paddington's innocence. Later that evening, Mrs. Brown was sitting in the bed drawing a picture of Madame Kozlova. There's got to be something we're missing, she said thoughtfully. Mr. Brown called out from the bathroom. So you keep saying, but what exactly? The stuff about the Flying Swan was a good yarn, but as for the book, Madame Kozlova told us it was just a homemade pop-up book. I know, said Mrs. Brown, but have you thought about why it was kept in a safe? Mr. Brown came out of the bathroom wearing a blue face mask. You're not telling me you believe all that guff she told us about the magician, he said. Mrs. Brown ignored him. She put 12 London landmarks in that book, she said. What if they are clues? Clues? Said Mr. Brown. Clues to what? To where the great-grandmother had hidden her fortune, Mrs. Brown said. You mean like a treasure map? Mr. Brown said. Exactly, said Mrs. Brown. She sat up excitedly. That would explain why the thief took the book from Mr. Gruber's. Mr. Brown began wiping off his face mask. I keep telling you, that fortune teller spun you a yarn. It's what they do, he said. Mrs. Brown looked annoyed suddenly. Honestly, darling, you're so close-minded these days. Mr. Brown bristled. What's that supposed to mean? What happened to Bullseye Brown? Mrs. Brown retorted. The man who sent coconuts flying with one hurl of a ball. He'd have believed me. Mr. Brown picked up the hand mirror, checked the wrinkles around his eyes. He's gone, Mary, he said, turning back to his wife. You're married to a creaky old man, not Bullseye Brown any more. Mrs. Brown tutted. Mr. Brown just ignored her. The point is, we're not going to help Paddington by going on a wild goose chase. We're looking for this scruffy chancer, he said, pointing to a picture of the poster Mrs. Brown and Judy had been made. Not some swashbuckling pirate who's hunting for treasure. Well, I think there's more to him than meets the eye, Mrs. Brown huffed. I think he somehow knew the story of the Kozlova fortune and is out there now trying to find it. Mr. Brown shrugged. It can't be the same man as Madame Kozlova's story. The magician would be a 150 by now. Remember, she said everything happened in the 1930s. We should be out there this minute, trying to catch him in the act, Henry. Mr. Brown snorted. Not right now, we're not, he said, getting into bed next to his wife. I'm going to get some beauty sleep. Goodness knows I need it. And with that, he turned out the light and put an end to the conversation. Meanwhile, as the Browns slept, a procession of nuns was slowly climbing the steps of St. Paul's Cathedral. It was a dark, moonless, silent night, and the black of the nuns' habits gave them a mysterious air as they walked along, merging with the shadows of the cold stone walls of the cathedral. It would not be difficult for one of them to slip away unnoticed. Phoenix Boochman knew this, which is why he could come to find the next clue dressed as one of the nuns. He waited until he was sure no one could see him, then he sneaked out of the procession and ran up the staircase to the Whispering Gallery. Grandfather, he said to himself, I'm going to doing this in your memory. They never appreciated your full worth as a magician. Why should all the money and the jewels have gone to that ridiculous Flying Swan woman? Her act was no better than yours, I'm sure. People just don't recognise a true artistic talent when they see it, and I should know. He sighed and made a beeline for the angel statue that he'd seen in the pop-up book. Then he swiftly ducked down to look at the bottom of the statue, where he spotted a letter, much like the one on Tower Bridge. It was carved into the marble base. A, he whispered, taking a note. 2 down, 10 more to go. Oi, what do you think you're doing? Phoenix jumped up, startled by the security guard who was waving at him and shouting into a walkie-talkie. Attention all units, he yelled. Phoenix panicked and caught the edge of the statue with his elbow. It teetered, then toppled over and smashed into pieces. An unusually attractive nun is causing mayhem in the cathedral dome, the guard shouted, as Phoenix ran. He shed his nun's habit as he went. Close in, the guard bellowed. Phoenix was too quick, however. By the time he had arrived at the bottom of the steps, he had changed his disguise and was wearing an archbishop's robe. He passed the guards quietly without attracting a second glance and disappeared into the night.